And hello to you, and welcome to the Richard Nicholls podcast, the personal development podcast series that's here to help inspire, educate, and motivate you to be the best you can be. I'm psychotherapist Richard Nicholls, and this is episode 202. It's titled Loneliness. And if you're ready, we'll start the show. How are you doing, you beautiful people? It looks as if we're slowly getting back to something resembling normal, doesn't it? Rightly or wrongly, COVID restrictions are supposed to be lifting in the next few days, or rather, there'll be no legal requirement anymore. You just have to be sensible. Which, if watching the reactions to the England-Italy game last week is anything to go by, being sensible isn't so easy to do when you're passionate and emotional. And meeting up with people again is going to be emotional, isn't it? It's been a lonely 18 months for a lot of us. But even before COVID, there were plenty of people saying that they were lonely and didn't have many opportunities to connect with people. Last month had the Loneliness Awareness Week campaign hosted by Marmalade Trust, which is a Bristol charity. That was the brainchild of therapist Amy Perrin in 2013 as a way of getting people to share their Christmas dinner with someone who lived alone. And this year was its biggest campaign yet. Despite everything being virtual, it still had over 200,000 organisations involved and reached over 270 million people, raising awareness of the loneliness problems we have in our so-called better connected world. And we've known that this problem exists for a while now. There's an often quoted study from 2004, which came out of the General Social Survey, that showed that 1 in 4 people had literally no one that they would call a friend. And it's not going to have improved any when they replicate the study, which they won't do for a while. It's usually every 20 years. And the comparisons from the previous one in the mid-80s really quite startling. The number of people saying that there is no one with whom they discuss important matters was 3 times as much in the mid-80s study of what it was 20 years later. Having 0 friends tripled in 20 years. And more recently, the BBC and the Wellcome Collection in London did a huge survey of 55,000 Brits to look at loneliness and its effects. And it's not nice reading, actually, because it makes you question a lot about how we're living in society nowadays. Because we used to associate loneliness with older age, with being retired and losing touch with people over time. But that's not the case anymore. It's all generations. Now, you can kind of understand it if the problem was restricted to a specific age group. If it was only for the over 75s, then you'd understand it and even almost accept it as a part of life. You know, it's sad, but people don't all die at the same time. There's no cut-off point, is there? So, of course, the older we get, the more of our friends we're going to lose, because the only ones experiencing the loneliness are the ones that's left behind. It's a crappy fact of life. But only 27% of over 75s said that they felt lonely often. The biggest age group was 16 to 24-year-olds, with 40%, and every other group was around 30 or 35%. So it's all ages. It's everywhere. So why aren't we talking about it? Why aren't we doing something about it? The good news is that the older generation, when asked to describe their loneliest time, did say that it was young adulthood for them too. So the issue isn't just modern life. Regulating our emotions seems to get easier as we age, as we have experiences that maybe put things into perspective. Who knows? Maybe it's a self-esteem thing. That does tend to increase as we age. No matter what, this problem has always been there. It's just that it's getting worse. It was 1 in 4 in the GSS survey from 2004, and the recent one averages out at 1 in 3, saying that they've got no friends. So what can we do? Well, if you're one of the 1 in 3 that might be struggling, I would first suggest reaching out to people that you've lost touch with. It's much easier to reconnect with old friends than it is to make new ones, by a massive measure. A quick text message or something that just says, "Hey stranger, long time no see. How are things at your end?" That could maybe turn into one of those really old-fashioned phone call things that we all used to make back in the day. Do you remember those? Phone calls when you talked to people? But if you do that, it can turn into a coffee shop catch-up on a Saturday morning, which is going to be great for both of you. And hopefully means that when they do the survey again, maybe it'll have at least gone back to the 1 in 4 saying they've got no friends and nobody to talk to. And then hopefully it's going to continue to improve. And if it feels really weird, the idea of reaching out to someone you haven't spoken to in a decade, here's a trick. Think about it from the other way around. How would you feel if they reached out to you? Would you be flattered? Would you be pleased? Would you think that they were awesome? Then assume the same for them. That's how you'd make them feel. So make it happen and challenge your expectation of rejection. We have this unconscious quirk to our psychology that means that we prime ourselves for the things that we expect, especially rejection. I refer you to the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences, volume 63, from a couple of years ago, where they published a study called Loneliness and Attention to Social Threat in Young Adults. Findings from an eye tracker study, it was called. It had long been hypothesised that lonely people are more vigilant to social threats. So, they got a load of people to fill out loneliness questionnaires and picked 40-odd who described themselves as not lonely and 40-odd who did, and they simply made them watch video clips of people having interactions in a canteen. Turns out, lonely people see the world differently to non-lonely folk. These video clips were made to contain both positive and negative interactions, you see. It would show people smiling and nodding at each other, but it would also show people turning their backs on someone, that sort of thing. And with the eye tracking technology, the researchers could see that the people who felt lonely were drawn towards those rejecting interactions automatically, and they missed the positive ones, and vice versa. The not lonely folk were drawn towards the smiles and nods, and they didn't notice the ignoring that went on, because we unconsciously look for what we fear as a protection mechanism. It's just what we do, and we need to know that we do this so that we can counter it, and maybe specifically go out of our way to look for the acceptance of ourselves from others' behaviour, to notice that they lent in so that they could listen to you, that they smiled, and push aside that they looked over your shoulder at something else behind you, or they glanced at their phone at one point. Because in other studies, what we found was that because the lonely people are more likely to expect rejection, they make only half-hearted attempts at connections, which gives everybody else around them the perception of a lack of interest, which then leads them to being excluded, and it fuels their fear of rejection and makes them even more lonely, and round it goes. What a nightmare. So if you end up meeting up with a group, one thing to bear in mind is probably something you've heard me say before, that negative emotions are based on the fight or flight response. Whether it's a fear of rejection or a fear of heights, it's still fear. And that emotion is going to make us anxious in our body, and it causes our brain to freeze, which means it's hard then to join in with conversations sometimes. But fear not, actually, anxious introverts, because the opposite to that isn't to be the life and soul of the party, because it's not binary. It isn't a dichotomy, one or the other. So to think that not being shy means you have to be over the top and a party animal is just not true. There's nothing wrong with just being there. Just being there, making eye contact, smiling and nodding and joining in when it's appropriate, asking questions if it's necessary, but just being present rather than passive. If you sit in the corner on your own at a party waiting for somebody to talk to you but refusing to make eye contact with anyone, you're probably in for a very long wait. If you want to make new friends rather than reconnecting with people, you're going to have to be a bit more patient though, because that's not as quick as sending somebody a text message that a week later ends up being a coffee. It's more likely you'll have to connect with people maybe that you work with, or go totally out of your way and join some sort of social group. But look at why you feel lonely so that you do the right thing. People put their loneliness down to lots of different reasons in the studies, you see. Some people say that they are physically isolated, others experience discrimination. Some found it hard to trust people, and others just didn't know where to find like-minded folk. If you can figure out why you feel lonely in the first place, it's a good first step to working out which solution is going to work best for you. And if one solution doesn't work, try something else. Not everyone is going to find benefit from joining a social group. It's on the list of the top most helpful things that people who overcame loneliness did, but it's also on the list of the most unhelpful as well, because you need to work out what works for you. And if you find the idea of talking to strangers quite intimidating, then maybe do something crafty, where you'll meet people, but there's no pressure to actually talk. Whereas finding groups of locals on meetup.com is going to be all about talking, probably. No matter what you do, I think the secret to it is to learn to trust other people. One thing that crops up a lot in the research into loneliness is that lonely people often struggle with trust. Who knows what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the lack of trust that programs them to look for rejection? Or is it constantly looking for rejection that leads to a lack of trust? Either way, it feeds itself, and it means you need to go out of your way to counteract it by purposefully looking for the good in everybody that you meet. If out of habit you think that somebody has rejected you or snubbed you, force yourself to look really hard at the evidence for whether it's actually true or not, so that you can then suggest alternative reasons for their behaviour. Maybe they were busy, maybe they were tired, maybe they were feeling down or anxious themselves. It was probably nothing to do with you. But if you do join a group of some sort, it's important to stick with it. It's too easy, out of habit, to give up on something at the first sign of it being tricky. Whatever you join, whatever you do, stick it out for at least 3 months, minimum. Bear in mind, when people make friends naturally, it's not because they have much in common, it's simply because of proximity. They're just in the same place at the same time. They're just there. And if you keep turning up and you're there too, you will feel connected and less lonely. One thing I would suggest is counselling. It's not a substitute as such for friendship, because the relationship is so very different. But it might help you to learn that you're not an alien, that you've got something to offer the world after all. And your therapist will challenge you if you start making excuses as to why you've not joined that arts project at your local community library, even though you said it was exactly what you needed. Now then, there's a flip side to all this, isn't there? I mean, what if you're not lonely at all, yet you've got this far into the episode, and you've obviously got patience and an interest in people. Now, you know, because of listening to me so far, that out of every 3 people around you, 1 of them feels lonely. And you know that it's not you. So that leaves 1 of the other 2, doesn't it? Well, maybe there's something you can do now that you know that lonely folk not only fear rejection, but look for it and are primed to see it and even then create it. Now you can be aware of that, and maybe just work a little bit harder at making sure that someone around you feels included, especially if they've got a history of feeling discriminated against. There's a big correlation there in those studies. The minority groups, those with disabilities, LGBTQ communities, and the ever-expanding inclusion in the acronym to include as many people as possible. So it's becoming a mouthful, but it gets the point across about the importance of feeling included. You can include as many people into an acronym as you like, though, when they're an adult, but it takes a bit more than that to simply override a childhood and adolescence where they felt excluded or different. There'll be a greater likelihood of insecurity, a background feeling that they're going to carry around with them everywhere they go, shaping how they see the world and how they fit in with it. And that is for all minorities. There's a reason why people stick together in their tribes. It feels safer. You're around people who understand you and your culture. There's a reason why cities have a Chinatown. Towns have an Asian area. Crikey. When I was growing up, there was an area in my old mining town in the Midlands that people called the Jockey State, because so many people who moved down from Scotland lived there because of the collieries, because it's a mining town. People stick together in their minorities because it makes us feel as if we fit in there. But that feeling of fitting in doesn't become the foundations to our personality when we're moving schools and moving house or whatever, and going to college or even going to university. What becomes our sense of self is only fitting in those very specific circumstances. And when we're out trying to live in the rest of the world, even if it's 10 minutes down the road, we carry with us that isolated, I don't belong here feeling. If we know that other people feel this way, then we might need to take a few extra steps to help them to feel included, minority or not. Look at the time, pod fans. I need to finish off. I've gone well over. It's 17 minutes plus. Like I always say, if you want to join in with my Patreon community, hop on over to patreon.com and become a patron of the podcast. You'll get access to loads more content. There's a new episode every Monday morning, including hours and hours of hypnotherapy content as well. You can also message me directly on there. I'm always happy to chat with my patrons. There's a community chat area as well, actually. We can all chat and support each other together. And if you don't want all of that, if you're not interested in too much extra content like the hypnotherapy stuff and the connections and community, if all you want is just some extra Monday morning episodes, you can actually, if you're an Apple user, you can subscribe to the extra episodes through Apple Podcasts. Apple recently added paid subscriber-only content to their podcasts app. So if that is all you want, you can get them that way if you prefer. Either way, I'll be back on Monday, and if you're on board one way or another, I'll talk to you then. Otherwise, I'll be back for the rest of you in August. Speak to you later, folks. Ta-ta!